Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery has been lionized in history books as perhaps the, great commander of World War II. The victory at Alamein, D-Day, the attacks against Germany in France, Holland, and Germany. I hope to show you that he was nothing of the kind, and was helped by others who put him in commands and covered up his mediocrity throughout the entire war. You might think I believe that Montgomery and his support system were almost unbelievably cynical, getting men killed for the stupidest of reasons. Yep, that's exactly what I think. Various themes will be presented here. Among them, for his offensives, beginning with his plan at Dieppe, and from then on, he carefully picked units so victory would appear to be by British units, but that non-British units would do his dying for him. And in this way, it would be the British who won the war, and still keep the United Kingdom relevant in the post-war world. But those dead men were not British men. They didn't really matter. Montgomery's scheme will make use of colonials, which in this case included soldiers from the United States, Canada, India, Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, Scotland, South Africans, and Poles. Why? Heavy British casualties would mean England would become a second-rate power in the post-war world. And the British people had had quite enough of hundreds of thousands of their sons and husbands killed in World War I, and were not at all interested in a repeat, Hitler or no. The colonials? They don't vote in British elections. Montgomery endlessly schemed to be the man who won the war. Montgomery was unimaginative in his battles, to the point of seeming to have never learned anything after World War I. He would not attack until he had a crushing advantage, and followed whatever plan it was inflexibly after that. A sign of his mediocrity is that even with crushing superiority, he sometimes still lost. Montgomery's only method of offense was to bludgeon his way through. When it came to defense, Montgomery was fortunate to have very few opportunities. But from his reaction to the Battle of the Bulge and at Market Garden, his general defense attitude was paralysis. All of Montgomery's plans put absolutely no thought whatsoever to what the Germans might do in response to his offensives. He ignored their ingenuity and amazing ability to improvise their defense. He just assumed that they'd do whatever he needed to do and was not able to improvise himself. When you're on the offensive, it's absolutely necessary to be able to take advantage of successes and recognize failures, or else your offensive will fail. On his own side, Montgomery saw enemies and traitors all around him. These were not limited to, but included, U.S. Generals Eisenhower, Bradley, Patton, British Admiral Ramsay, British Generals Humphrey Gale, F.E. Morgan, K. Strang, J. Whiteley, RAF General Lee Mallory, and Canadian Generals McNaughton and Crerar. He spent endless time writing messages, mostly to Brooke, to have them removed from whatever post they held, especially after Eisenhower supplanted Montgomery on the continent as Supreme Commander of all forces. Montgomery was positively traitorous in his attempts to shove Eisenhower into the background in favor of, himself. He actively subverted any other command but his own. At Normandy, Antwerp, Market Garden, and later at the Rhine crossing, Montgomery's plans always seemed to have the side effect of slowing down perceived rivals. He blamed others for his failures. He denigrated the fighting capabilities of non-British troops. He denigrated the abilities of non-British generals and claimed credit for self-described victories. In carrying out his mediocrity, Montgomery was entirely protected by Alan Brooke and Churchill. He had been trumpeted as the man who could win the war and thus was immune from judgment, and Montgomery knew it. In this and other video essays I'm going to profile, they all had a patron on high. For Montgomery, it was Brooke. For Stilwell, it was Marshall. For Halsey, it was Nimitz, and for Zhukov, it was Stalin. All these men had an obsession with being the man who won the war, and all these men were not the man who won the war. But onward. Here we go with Montgomery up through Alamein in 1942. So let's look at Montgomery before World War II. In World War I, Montgomery's military activities were pretty average. He was wounded in October 1914 and spent the rest of the war in France on the general staff, far away from the front. After World War I, he spent some command time in Ireland. There, he's primarily remembered for retreating when confronted by the IRA, and a quote, "It never bothered me a bit how many houses were burnt. My own view is that to win a war of this sort, you must be ruthless." After that, Montgomery spent time in various staff schools, where he met the man who would make his career in Montgomery's reputation as the hero he was manufactured into. This man will appear regularly in our story, always to Montgomery's advantage, General Alan Brooke. In the late 1930s, Montgomery spent time in Palestine, suppressing and killing people there. His intention was to subdue uppity Arabs with, as he said himself, starvation and ruin. Montgomery gave explicit orders to shoot to kill men who were acting suspiciously. and firing on any civilians he or any subordinate deemed to be containing bandits. Just like in Ireland, Montgomery described his efforts as fighting a war, which he privately said he enjoyed very much. World War II began for Montgomery as commander of the 3rd Infantry Division in the Battle for France in 1940. The 3rd Division, along with the rest of the BEF, was mostly engaged in fierce running away. Indeed, the 3rd Division was noticed as being very efficient at running away. After being rescued to England, Alan Brooke was selected to command all home, that is, in England, army forces, and he picked, surprise, Montgomery to command forces in southeast England to defend against an attack by nobody. That pesky RAF and the Royal Navy, they made the Germans not invade. So Montgomery had nothing to do. In 1942, Montgomery was the chief planner for what became the raid on Dieppe, the ironically named Operation Jubilee. Since Montgomery was in charge of picking what troops were to be sent, Montgomery began his habit of choosing non-British men to do most of the dying for him. In this case, it was Canadians. British participation was limited to commandos, destroyer and transport crews, and most of the RAF aircraft that were used. The commandos were to use the Canadians' assault as a cover for very brave sneaking around and blowing things up. The Canadians, however, were to make a frontal attack into the teeth of unsuppressed German fortifications. In addition to being charged with the planning, Montgomery fully expected to command the landing himself. Although he and Montgomery-friendly writers during and after the war tried to minimize his participation in Dieppe, the raid itself was sold as a micro-invasion, with infantry, commandos, and tanks landing to seize the port, supported by the Royal Navy and the RAF. The objectives were not just to take Dieppe, but to advance further inland to towns behind the beach. But before the raid, the Royal Navy and the RAF suddenly told the Jubilee planning staff, that is, Montgomery, that no heavy ships or heavy bombers would be used to support the landing. The Royal Navy and the RAF, it turns out, was afraid that their battleships and big bombers might get a scratch on them. In the end, only destroyers with 4-inch pop guns would provide gunfire support to the landings. By the way, it was much later asserted that a commando group of exactly 5 men were sent along with the Dieppe raid to seize a German Navy Enigma machine. Those Enigma machines were different and better than the ones the Army used, and any codebooks that might be found. By this telling, the Dieppe raid with thousands of men, ships, and aircraft was to get 5 men ashore. These 5 commandos didn't obtain anything. Now, Bletchley Park broke the Naval Enigma encoding 2 months after the Dieppe raid. So if this Enigma snatch story is true, 1,000 Canadians died at Dieppe for something that was about to be obtained anyway. So why, really, attack at Dieppe at all? Churchill had promised Stalin, who was up to his eyeballs in the German 1942 offensive to Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil fields, that the Western Allies would do something that would draw German attention and hopefully manpower away from the Eastern Front. This is all that was done, until the torch landings in Western Africa in November. The Canadians were sent to die, to try and prove to the Russians that Churchill was willing to get somebody killed to claim he was helping the Russians. For his part, in his memoirs, Montgomery actually does talk about Dieppe. Out of 532 pages, he spends a page and a half pointing fingers at other people, making sure that you know that nothing was his fault. This is the first, but by no means the last time, Montgomery will finger point to distract people for his own culpability. Montgomery standing heroically on top of piles of Commonwealth and American dead will be a recurring event in our story. It was said at the time, and in various histories, that wanted a happy ending to a miserable disaster, that the raid was a failure but a success, and lessons were learned at Dieppe which would be crucial to a success at D-Day. There was plenty to be learned about invading in the Pacific from the Americans. Substitute England for aircraft carriers, and the problems and solutions are exactly the same. But Montgomery wasn't about to learn anything from those Americans, who he said repeatedly and loudly they couldn't do much of anything right. Alan Brooke saw his protege involved in a risky operation, so Montgomery was, just before the landings, whisked off to Egypt to avoid any association with the Dieppe failure. On his way out the door, Montgomery suddenly decided that the operation he had planned might need to be changed, that it might be better to be tried elsewhere than Dieppe. The reasoning, he said, was not that the planning of the operation was badly flawed, but that security for the operation might have been compromised. It wasn't, but it was the best one he could think of at the time. Montgomery's "if they had only listened" tactic would appear again in his illustrious career, and for the same reason. Montgomery was laying a marker down to be able to profit no matter what happened. If the raid was a failure, well, he had said it was a bad idea. If it succeeded, it was his plan, and he didn't even have to be there to carry it off. Montgomery's plan for Dieppe was absurdly complex and required strict adherence to a timetable that was, of course, not possible. This inflexibility, as we will see, is another trademark of Montgomery's plans. One Dieppe landing group ran into an unexpected German naval convoy and lost their cohesion and scheduling. A firefight between gunboats on both sides was ignored by nearby British destroyers because they thought it was fire from the beachhead, when it rather obviously wasn't. But the Germans on shore were now alerted that something was up. Commandos landed on either side of the Canadian landing beaches, ordered to knock out a couple of heavy artillery batteries that could fire on the landing force. This they did, but lost most of their number doing it. The main Canadian landings, right into the teeth of the German defenses, were a bloody disaster. German fire came from in front and the flanks and above on the cliffs right next to the beach. Landing craft were shot up badly by light artillery in the fortified landing zone. Tanks were landed on the beach, but somebody forgot to check that the beach, largely pebbly, would support tank movement. A few tanks made it off the beach, but no further. The rest floundered around on the beach, eventually throwing tracks on the unexpectedly pebbly beach. The tanks that did make it off the beach were stymied by the Germans, who had been unsporting enough to put obstacles on their roads. What a surprise. The continuing disaster on the beach was ignored by commanders offshore, and 2 additional waves of Canadians were sent to their dooms because it was in the plan. 8 hours after the Canadians began landing, the fight was over. Nearly 1,000 Canadians were dead, nearly 2,000 captured. 550 Royal Navy sailors were dead or wounded, who crewed the 33 sunken landing craft and a destroyer. Around 600 Germans were casualties, about half killed. The Luftwaffe lost 48 aircraft, the RAF lost 120. 2 Spitfires were lost when they ran into each other. A Typhoon was shot down by a Spitfire. 6 British aircraft were shot down by British anti-aircraft fire, and 2 Typhoons were lost when their tails fell off. Now, I'm not making that up. Dieppe was a failure through and through. Nothing was learned except what should have been known before. Don't land in front of unsuppressed enemy strongpoints. Don't land in the dark because your landing craft will get lost. Don't land on unsuitable terrain because things will not go well. Have naval support close enough to see targets that matter. Know who you're facing. Planners didn't know that the Germans facing them were regulars, not fortress troops, or that they had reinforcements quickly available. Now, let's see what's happening over in Egypt. Rommel's advance into Egypt had run up against Allied defenses at El Alamein. From July 1st to the 27th, Rommel attacked the 8th Army in Egypt in the First Battle of Alamein. The Allied commander, General Claude Auchinleck, had carefully picked the Alamein position. To the south of the British defenses was what was known as the Qattara Depression, a sand sea impassable to vehicles of any sort. So Rommel's go-around the southern flank tactic would not work. Rommel's attack failed in the face of Auchinleck's careful placement of Allied tanks, anti-tank guns, minefields, and artillery units. RAF fighters dominated the skies, hamstringing any German air support. Rommel's lengthy supply lines back to Tripoli meant that fuel, replacements, ammunition, food, and water had to travel 1,100 miles to get to his position. Meanwhile, Auchinleck's supplies had to come 60 miles from Alexandria. By the 27th of July, Rommel was stymied, unable to get any closer to the Nile than when he started the battle. He gave up on the First Battle of Alamein and settled into defensive positions. For the British, it was a great victory. Rommel was stuck at the end of a long supply line and doomed. He couldn't go forward, and Hitler wouldn't let him go back. Churchill, back in England, was desperate for some good news. Churchill was unable to see the situation in Egypt for what it was. For him, victory meant taking ground. In this case, many square miles of desert. So Churchill decided he needed to replace the commander of the 8th Army in Egypt. That is, he wanted to replace Auchinleck, the only British commander to fight Rommel to a standstill, with somebody else. It was the First Battle of Alamein that really mattered, and it was won before Monty even left England. Auchinleck's defense at the Alamein line and winning against Rommel's attack assured that Rommel could not defend for long, much less attack again in force. Auchinleck knew that now that Rommel had been stopped cold, all he had to do was wait, let Rommel stand at Alamein and wither on the vine. Besides, he knew the torch landings were coming up, and Rommel would have to flee the Alamein line anyway, leaving behind all his infantry without Auchinleck having to lose a single man. First Alamein was a hugely important victory, the one that won the Battle of the Western Desert, unless you're Winston Churchill. 6 days after the end of First Alamein, on August 3rd, Churchill and Brooke breezed into Cairo intent on firing Auchinleck. To replace him, Churchill had designated General William Gott, an able veteran campaigner in the desert. But Gott got killed in a plane crash. Churchill then picked General Henry Wilson, another man with long experience fighting in the desert. Then Churchill made a terrible mistake. He asked Brooke for advice. Brooke talked up Montgomery, whose only desert experience was shooting Palestinians. Churchill took the advice. So for all the post-battle hoopla, Montgomery was literally a third-string command choice. So Brooke was able to carry out 2 objectives: replace Auchinleck and rescue Montgomery from association with the upcoming Dieppe operation. I'm not sure that Montgomery's lack of higher command experience or lack of desert experience even entered Brooke's mind. That's not what this change of command was about at all. On August 13, 1942, Montgomery took command of the 8th Army. 6 days later, on August 19th, was the disastrous landing at Dieppe. But Monty was safely away and able to claim no part in it. He was elbows deep in the Dieppe planning, but especially after Second Alamein, that particular inconvenience could be safely swept under the rug, and so it was, for decades. Before he left, Auchinleck had planned a counteroffensive, which would become the Second Battle of Alamein, for September 1942. Churchill had then fired Auchinleck for such timidity. Montgomery told Churchill he would be much more aggressive and attack in October. In fact, the entire Allied campaign to kick Rommel out of Egypt and Libya was Auchinleck, just carried out really badly by Montgomery. By the way, Rommel later described Auchinleck as one of the best generals the British had. Before we get to the battle, let's look at some more dates. The Second Battle of Alamein begins on October 23rd. The torch landings begin on November 8th. Alamein ends on November 11th. Montgomery had 2 full weeks to beat Rommel with a 5-to-1 advantage in tanks, a 3-to-1 advantage in infantry, all the artillery in the world, air supremacy, and a mountain of supplies, so he could steal the thunder of the torch landings. Post-war history will write the battle so that Montgomery won the battle on the 4th. But Rommel wasn't kicked back across the Egyptian border until the 11th. That was the last time Montgomery had a chance to crush Rommel in place. In the histories, if the battle ends on the 4th, Montgomery's a hero. If it ends on the 11th, he's just taking advantage of the torch invasion, and the Second Battle of Alamein got men killed for nothing. This will become a recurring result in Montgomery's battles. But back to our story of Second Alamein. On August 30th, Rommel made one last throw of the dice to hook around the British line and defeat the 8th Army. The attack was easily shrugged off, and the attack foundered because of a lack of tanks and fuel. It was called off 2 days after it began. A counterattack against a different part of the German-Italian lines, almost inevitably by New Zealanders, was another Monty disaster. But Montgomery was now free to plan his October masterpiece. When it came to actually fight the Second Battle of Alamein, Montgomery fought it like a battle out of World War I. Massive artillery barrage, followed by an infantry attack, with armored divisions as cavalry waiting to exploit a breakthrough made by the infantry, right out of 1915. Against the accepted, at the time, military thinking, Montgomery did not mix his armored and infantry divisions into a more flexible and thus more powerful force. As will happen again, Montgomery's armored units will get in each other's way and make resupply of the tanks almost impossible. Finally, on October 23rd, Montgomery's grand attack on Rommel kicked off. The timing, as we have seen, had nothing to do whatsoever with Rommel's position or the supply situation. The initial attack was made by the 30th Corps, made up of, you guessed it, infantry divisions of Indians, New Zealanders, Australians, South Africans, and Scots. Montgomery's plan expected a breakthrough in 1 day, with the British armored divisions driving through the breakthrough to glory. But the infantry attack quickly bogged down. 3 days later, Montgomery claimed he was regrouping to try and crack the German lines. In reality, he was just still attacking with his colonials. Montgomery waited, while the colonials died, to commit his armored corps of 3 divisions, and waited, for nearly 2 weeks. Finally, since his World War I plan was not working, he decided to improvise, to try and make the breakthrough for the armored divisions to exploit with the armored divisions themselves. When a breakthrough did finally occur, Montgomery had to spend more days reorganizing again, and by the time he finished reorganizing, 2 of his 3 armored divisions were out of fuel, and the other was held up by Rommel's anti-tank guns. Rommel wanted to retreat away from Alamein to keep the Africa Corps intact and live to fight another day. But Hitler, ever the military genius, forbade it. If Rommel had been able to retreat when he wanted, Montgomery's great victory would have been against nobody. November 4th, Montgomery attacked again unsuccessfully. Meanwhile, Rommel had decided to retreat no matter what Hitler said. Montgomery took a couple of days to notice, and then 2 of his armored divisions were found to be out of fuel again, and the other was trapped in a traffic jam. Casting about to explain his failure, Montgomery literally blamed God, saying that a rainstorm had slowed him down. I guess it didn't rain on the Germans. By November 7th, British tanks were attacking Rommel's rear guard, but were unable to stop Rommel's freestyle fleeing to the west. By the 10th, with a 25-to-1 advantage in tanks and a 4-to-1 advantage in infantry, Montgomery was still stymied by Rommel's rear guard. Rommel crossed back into Libya. It was not until the 11th that Montgomery let slip the last chance to crush Rommel and the Africa Corps. So it was not until the 11th that the Battle of Alamein can be said to be over, as Rommel continued to retreat, followed by, slightly slower than the Germans, the 8th Army. So Second Alamein was finally over. Rommel's Italian leg infantry, who just couldn't run fast enough, were largely captured, but the core of the Africa Corps still existed, and retreated in good order, throwing up various blocking positions back toward Tunisia. We'll come to all that in the next video, from mediocre to still mediocre. But Churchill hailed Montgomery as a hero, a military genius. And there's a problem with that. Churchill's lionization of Montgomery as the victor of Alamein meant that Churchill could not now remove Montgomery from command for pretty much any reason, despite more capable men being readily available. For example, Horrocks, Alexander, William Slim, and of course Auchinleck. But Montgomery knew he was safe, with Churchill essentially blackmailed, and with Brooks' slavish support. It's the only reason that as the war went on and Montgomery kept screwing up, that he stayed in his exalted position, able to get men killed without let or hindrance. After the war, Churchill wrote, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." As Churchill knew perfectly well, that's not true. Before Alamein, the defensive battle of Britain was won decisively by the RAF. First Alamein was won by Auchinleck. After Alamein, there was Caen, which was a series of defeats, and Market Garden, which was a disaster. We'll get to that and some others. So we'll see you next time as Montgomery bollocks up the pursuit of Rommel, and the attack toward Tunis, the attack toward Messina, and the advance in Italy, until Montgomery is whisked away again, this time to England, by Brooke. Again. Bye-bye.